Margaret Hayes had always believed that love, once given fully, would come back to her in time. For 40 years, she had built her life around that belief. She raised her son, Daniel, with patience and sacrifice, pouring every ounce of her strength into giving him a future she never had. She stayed up through sleepless nights when he was sick, worked extra hours when money was tight, and stood quietly in the background as he grew into a successful man. And when her husband passed away 2 years ago, Margaret held onto one comforting thought. At least I still have my family. That illusion didn't shatter all at once. It broke slowly,
Quietly.
almost politely. It started with small conversations, Daniel stopping by more often, bringing his wife, Sophia, who always wore a perfectly measured smile. They spoke in gentle tones about helping Margaret manage things now that she was alone. "You shouldn't have to worry about paperwork anymore, Mom," Daniel had said one afternoon, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sophia nodded beside him. "We just want to make things easier for you." Margaret had smiled back, grateful. She didn't notice how their questions became more specific, how their visits became more frequent, how the documents they brought slowly shifted from simple bills to legal forms. "Just routine updates," Sophia would say, sliding papers across the table with effortless confidence. Nothing complicated. Margaret trusted them. Why wouldn't she? This was her son, the boy she had carried for 9 months, the child she had loved without condition.
So she signed.
Again, and again, and again. It wasn't until 3 months later that everything changed. The knock on the door came early in the morning. Margaret opened it to find a man in a dark suit holding a folder. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, confused. "I'm here regarding the transfer of property ownership." Her heart skipped. "I'm sorry, what transfer?" The man glanced down at his documents. "The house has been legally transferred to Mr. Daniel Hayes." For a moment, Margaret simply stared at him. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. "This is my home," she said softly. There must be a mistake. But deep down, something inside her already knew the truth. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look guilty. If anything, he looked impatient. "Mom," he sighed, stepping inside as if nothing had changed, "we've already talked about this." Margaret's hands trembled. "I never agreed to give you the house." Sophia walked in behind him, her expression calm. "You signed the documents, Margaret," she said gently. Everything was done legally. Legally. The word felt like a knife. Margaret looked from her son to the woman beside him, the woman who now stood in her home, as if she belonged there. "This house," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking, "your father built it with his own hands." Daniel avoided her eyes. "Well, things change." That was the moment it ended. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with a quiet, unbearable clarity. Margaret Hayes was no longer a mother in her own home. She was an inconvenience, and by the end of the week, she would be gone. Margaret Hayes left the house with only one suitcase. She didn't take much. Not because there wasn't more to take, but because, somehow, none of it felt like hers anymore. The furniture had been chosen together with her husband. The curtains still carried the faint scent of lavender he used to love. Even the old wooden dining table, scratched from years of family dinners, held memories that now felt distant, untouchable. So she packed what she could carry. A few changes of clothes. A framed photograph of her and her husband, taken on their 25th anniversary, and the small silver ring he had given her long before they could afford anything more. When she stepped out the front door, Daniel wasn't there to say goodbye. Sophia was. Standing in the hallway, arms folded lightly, watching. Not cruel, not kind, just finished. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," she said, her voice smooth, polite, almost as if she were speaking to a neighbor. Margaret nodded. She didn't trust her voice. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And just like that, 40 years of life became something that existed only in memory. The first few nights were the hardest. Margaret rented a small room above a convenience store on the edge of town. The space smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old wood. The bed creaked when she sat down, and the window overlooked a narrow alley where delivery trucks passed at all hours of the night. It wasn't home, but it was something. She lay awake that first night, staring at the ceiling, listening to unfamiliar sounds.
No ticking clock. No familiar footsteps.
No quiet presence beside her. Just silence. A different kind of silence. One that didn't comfort but echoed. By the third day, Margaret knew she couldn't rely on what little savings she had left. Not anymore. So she went looking for work. At 60, the world doesn't open doors easily. Most places didn't even bother, hiding their hesitation. Managers glanced at her resume, then at her age, offering tight smiles and vague promises. "We'll call you." No one did. Until she found the diner. It sat at the corner of a busy street, nothing fancy. Just a small, aging place with faded red booths and a bell that rang every time the door opened. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Carla, looked Margaret up and down for a long moment. "You ever worked service before?" she asked. Margaret hesitated. "Years ago," she said softly. "When I was young." Carla shrugged. "Good enough. I need someone who shows up on time and doesn't cause trouble." Margaret nodded. "I won't." And just like that, she had a job. The work was harder than she remembered. Her feet ached after the first shift. Her hands moved slower than they used to. And some customers barely looked at her when they spoke, snapping fingers, leaving coins instead of bills, treating her like part of the furniture rather than a person. But Margaret endured. She learned the rhythm again. Coffee first. Menus second. Smile. Even when it wasn't returned. And little by little, she found something she hadn't expected. Not comfort. Not happiness. But stability. A quiet, fragile sense that she could still stand on her own. Even now. Even after everything. On her fifth day, during a short break behind the kitchen, Margaret opened her small lunch container. Inside was half a sandwich. She had saved the other half from the night before. Carefully wrapped. Carefully portioned. She took a small bite, chewing slowly, as if stretching the moment could make it last longer. Because now, every piece mattered. Every dollar. Every meal. Every breath forward. Margaret Hayes had lost her home. She had lost her family. But she had not lost herself. Not yet. Margaret noticed him on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't because he spoke. He didn't. It wasn't because he ordered anything unusual. He didn't. In fact, if anything, he was easy to miss. An older man, perhaps in his late 60s or early 70s, sitting alone in the far corner of the diner, at the booth closest to the window, where the sunlight barely reached. His coat was worn at the edges, the fabric thinning at the elbows. His shoes were clean but old, carefully maintained, as if he respected what little he had. He came in quietly, sat down, and waited. The man turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. There was something steady in his gaze. Not demanding, not distant, just observant. "Just a coffee," he said.
His voice was calm.
Measured. Margaret nodded. Of course. When she brought it over, he thanked her. Not absent-mindedly, not automatically, but with intention. "Thank you," he said again, as she placed the cup in front of him.
It was a small thing.
But Margaret noticed, because not many people said it like that anymore. He returned the next day, and the day after that. Always the same seat, always the same order. Coffee.
Black. No sugar. No rose.
Margaret began to recognize the pattern, and without realizing it, she began to watch him, the same way he seemed to quietly watch the world. There was something different about him. He didn't carry the restless energy of most customers. He didn't scroll through a phone, didn't check a watch, didn't look around to see who was noticing him. He simply existed. Still. Present. As if he had nowhere else he needed to be. On the fourth day, Margaret noticed something else. When the bill came, the man paused. Not long. Just long enough. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the receipt, as if calculating something silently in his mind. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few carefully folded bills. Exact change. Not a penny more. Margaret said nothing, but something in her chest tightened slightly, because she understood that pause. She had lived inside it herself. Later that afternoon, during her break, Margaret opened her lunch container again. The same as before. Half a sandwich, wrapped neatly, saved carefully. She took a bite, chewing slowly, when she saw him, still sitting there. The coffee long finished, the cup empty, but he hadn't left. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she stood up and walked over. "You've been sitting here a while," she said gently. "Would you like another coffee?" The man looked up at her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes this time. Not surprise. Not quite. Something softer. "I shouldn't," he said. "I've already stayed longer than I paid for." Margaret glanced at the empty cup, then back at him. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I'll bring it anyway." He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand something unspoken. Then he gave a small nod. "Thank you." When she returned with the fresh cup, she hesitated again. Then, slowly, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out her sandwich, and placed half of it gently on the table beside him. "It's nothing special," she said, almost apologetically. "But you should eat something." For a moment, the man didn't move. His eyes shifted from the sandwich to her face. And, in that silence, something changed. Something subtle. Something important. "I can't take that," he said quietly. Margaret smiled. "You can," she replied. "I insist." He looked at her a little longer. Then, carefully, he accepted it. "Thank you," he said again. This time, his voice carried something deeper. Not just gratitude, but recognition. That was the moment it began. Not with a grand gesture, not with a dramatic exchange, but with half a sandwich, shared between two strangers who had both, in their own ways, lost more than they could ever explain. Margaret didn't expect anything to come from that small moment. A cup of coffee, half a sandwich, a quiet thank you. In a world that had taken so much from her, she had learned not to expect anything in return. And yet, the next day he came back. He walked in at the same hour, chose the same seat, and nodded slightly when she approached, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. "The usual?" Margaret asked gently. "Yes," he replied. "If that's all right." "It is." This time, when she placed the coffee in front of him, he didn't immediately look out the window. Instead, he said, "You didn't have to do that yesterday." Margaret paused. "Do what?" "The sandwich." She gave a small, almost dismissive smile. "It wasn't much." "It was," he said quietly. There was no exaggeration in his tone.
No dramatics.
Just truth. Margaret didn't answer, because she knew what he meant. Sometimes, the smallest things were the hardest to give. Over the next few days, a rhythm began to form. Not forced, not planned, just natural. Margaret would bring his coffee before he asked. He would thank her, every time, as if it mattered. And slowly, little pieces of conversation began to fill the space between them. Nothing heavy at first, just fragments. "Busy day." "A little." "The weather's changing." "Yes, that is." Simple words. But there was something different in the way they spoke. They listened, truly listened, as if neither of them had many people left who did. One afternoon, the diner was quieter than usual. The lunch rush had passed, and the late crowd hadn't arrived yet. Sunlight filtered weakly through the window, casting soft shadows across the table where he sat. Margaret approached with his coffee and lingered a moment longer than usual. "You come here every day," she said. He nodded. "It's peaceful." She glanced around the diner, the clatter from the kitchen, the faint hum of an old refrigerator, the occasional ring of the bell at the door. "Peaceful?" she repeated, a hint of surprise in her voice. He gave a small smile. "Yes. People think peace is silence. But sometimes it's just being somewhere you're not invisible." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Invisible. The word lingered, because she understood it more than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, she didn't just bring him coffee. She brought him a small bowl of soup. "I didn't order this," he said, looking at it. "I know," she replied. "I can't pay for it." "You don't have to." He hesitated. "I don't like taking things I haven't earned." Margaret met his eyes. And I don't like watching someone go hungry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he picked up the spoon. Days turned into a week. And what began as quiet exchanges became something deeper. He told her his name, William. Just William. No last name. No details. And she didn't press, because she knew what it meant to hold parts of your life close. But he listened when she spoke. Really listened. And one evening, as the diner lights dimmed and the last customers drifted out, Margaret found herself saying something she hadn't said out loud to anyone. "I used to have a home," she said softly. William didn't interrupt, didn't question. He simply sat there waiting, giving her the space to continue. And for the first time since she lost everything, Margaret Hayes didn't feel alone while telling her story. Margaret didn't plan to tell him everything. At first, it was just fragments, carefully chosen pieces of a life she wasn't sure she could still call her own. "I used to live not far from here," she said one evening, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "A small house. Nothing special." William nodded, saying nothing, encouraging her, without pushing. "My husband built it," she continued. "Took him nearly 2 years. Every weekend, every spare hour, he worked on it." A faint smile touched her lips. He used to say, every wall had a story. William's gaze softened. "That sounds like a good man." "He was," Margaret said quietly. "Very good." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just respectful. The next day she shared a little more. Not because he asked, but because he didn't. "I have a son," she said, as she poured his coffee. William looked up slightly. "Have," he repeated gently. Margaret hesitated, then corrected herself. "I had," she said. "At least, that's what it feels like now." William didn't react, didn't offer sympathy, didn't interrupt. He simply listened, and somehow, that made it easier to continue. Over the following days, the story unfolded, piece by piece. Margaret told him about Daniel, how he used to run into her arms after school, how he once cried over a broken toy, how he used to promise he'd take care of her forever. She told him about Sophia, the polite smiles, the careful words, the way everything always seemed controlled. And finally, she told him the truth. "They took everything," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. The diner was quiet. Only the low hum of the kitchen filled the space between them. "I trusted them," she continued. "I signed what they put in front of me. I didn't even read it properly. I didn't think I had to." Her hands trembled slightly. "I thought I was helping them." William's jaw tightened, just for a moment. A subtle shift, but Margaret noticed. "And then one day," she said, swallowing hard, "a man knocked on my door and told me my house didn't belong to me anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy, unavoidable. For a long time, William didn't speak. He sat there, his hands folded, his gaze steady, but something behind it had changed. Something sharper, colder. "Did they explain?" he asked finally. Margaret let out a soft, bitter breath. "They said it was legal." Legal. The same word that had cut her before. "I was an inconvenience," she added quietly. William's fingers curled slightly against the table. "And now?" he asked. Margaret gave a small shrug. "Now I work here. I rent a room. I get by." She forced a faint smile. "It's not so bad." But her eyes said otherwise. That evening, as Margaret walked back toward the kitchen, William remained at the table. Still, silent. But his mind was no longer at rest. He replayed every word she had said, every detail, every hesitation. This wasn't just a story of loss. It was something else. Something calculated. Something wrong. The next time Margaret returned, he looked at her differently. Not with pity, but with something far more dangerous. Clarity. "You trusted them," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. "Yes." William held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he said, almost to himself, "That should have meant something." For the first time since they met, William Carter wasn't just listening anymore. He was thinking. And somewhere deep beneath his calm exterior, a decision had already begun to form. The diner door opened with a sharper sound than usual that afternoon. Not the soft chime Margaret had grown used to, but something louder, more deliberate. She glanced up from the counter, instinctively, and immediately felt it. A shift. Two figures stepped inside. Well-dressed, confident, out of place. Daniel Hayes walked in first, his posture straight, his expression already carrying a trace of impatience. Behind him, Sophia followed, elegant as always, her eyes scanning the room with quiet judgment. Margaret froze. For a split second, she thought she might be imagining it.
But no.
It was them, her son, and the woman who had taken everything from her. Daniel's gaze swept across the diner and then stopped. On her, recognition flickered across his face. Not surprise. Not guilt. Just mild annoyance. "Mom," he said, as if the word felt foreign in his mouth. Margaret straightened slowly. Her hands tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. "Daniel." Sophia stepped forward beside him, her lips curving into a small, practiced smile. "Well," she said lightly, "this is unexpected." Her eyes moved over Margaret's uniform, the apron, the worn shoes, taking everything in, assessing. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier,
Thicker.
Then Daniel exhaled sharply. "So this is where you ended up," he said. Not a question, a statement. Margaret swallowed. "I work here," she replied quietly. He let out a short laugh. "You don't have to say it like that. I can see that." The words weren't loud, but they carried. A few customers nearby shifted uncomfortably. From the corner of the room, William watched, his expression unreadable, but his attention sharp, focused. Daniel walked a few steps closer. "You could have called," he said. "We would have helped you find something more suitable." More suitable. The phrase lingered in the air. Margaret's chest tightened. "I didn't need your help," she said softly. Sophia tilted her head slightly. "Of course," she replied, "because this is clearly better." Her gaze swept the diner again, lingering just long enough to make her meaning clear. Margaret said nothing, because anything she said now would only give them more control, more satisfaction. So she held her silence, the same way she had before. Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand why you're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Everything we did was legal." Legal. Again. Always that word. Margaret felt it settle in her chest like something cold and heavy. "I trusted you," she said. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Daniel's expression flickered, just for a moment, then hardened. "You sign the papers," he replied. "That's how the world works." Behind them, Sophia's attention drifted, toward the far corner, toward William. She studied him briefly, dismissed him. Just another old man in a worn coat. Irrelevant. Margaret followed her gaze for a second. Their eyes met. Hers, tired but steady. His, no longer calm. Daniel let out a breath, clearly losing patience. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "We didn't come here to argue. We just wanted to see how you were doing." The lie sat plainly between them, unhidden, unconvincing. Margaret nodded once. "I fine." Sophia smiled again. "That's good," she said, "because we wouldn't want you struggling." The words were gentle, but the meaning wasn't. Silence fell again, heavier this time, until Daniel finally turned away. "Come on," he said to Sophia. "Let's go somewhere decent. Something decent. Not here. Not this place. Not her." As they walked toward the door, Margaret remained where she stood. Still, composed, unmoving. But inside, something had shifted. Not broken. Not this time. Something else. And, in the corner, William Carter slowly placed his coffee cup down. His gaze followed Daniel and Sophia as they left. Measured, cold, decisive. Because what he had just witnessed was no longer just a story. It was proof. The door closed behind Daniel and Sophia, but the silence they left behind didn't leave with them. It stayed. Heavy, unsettling, lingering in every corner of the diner. Margaret remained standing where she was, her hands still resting on the counter, her posture straight.
Composed.
From the outside, nothing about her had changed. But inside, everything was trembling. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. One of the customers near the window cleared his throat. Another looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his food. No one spoke, because everyone had seen, everyone had heard, and no one knew what to say. Margaret inhaled slowly, then exhaled, and just like that, she moved, back into motion, back into routine, as if nothing had happened. "Refill?" she asked a man at table 3, her voice calm, steady. He blinked, startled. "Oh, a yes, please." She nodded and poured the coffee with practiced hands.
Nos checking. No hesitation.
Just quiet precision. But William saw it. He saw the way her fingers tightened slightly around the pot, the way her shoulders held just a little too stiff, the way her eyes avoided the door. She was holding herself together, piece by piece. A younger waitress in the corner leaned toward another and whispered softly, "Was that her son?" The other nodded. "That's awful." Margaret heard it. Of course she did. But she gave no sign. Because dignity, once all you have left, becomes something you protect at all costs. She returned to William's table last, not because she forgot, but because she needed a moment, just one, to steady herself. When she finally approached, she carried his coffee like always. Same steps, same care, same quiet presence. "Your coffee," she said gently. William looked up at her. For a brief second, their eyes met. And in that moment, there was no pretending, no distance.
No polite illusion.
He saw the pain she refused to show, and she saw the anger he wasn't trying to hide anymore. "You didn't have to stay silent," William said quietly. Margaret placed the cup down carefully. "Yes," she replied. "I did." Her voice wasn't weak. It wasn't broken. It was controlled, intentional. "They humiliated you," he said. Margaret shook her head slightly. "No," she said. Then, after a pause, "They revealed themselves." William's gaze sharpened. She folded her hands lightly in front of her. "I already lost my home," she continued softly. "I won't lose myself, too." The words settled between them. Simple, but unshakable. For the first time since they met, William leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her, not as someone to feel sorry for,
but as someone to respect.
Across the room, the bell above the door rang again. New customers entered. Voices returned. The world moved forward, as it always does, indifferent, unchanged. But something had changed. Not in the diner, not in the people, but in him. William Carter placed his hand slowly on the table, his fingers tapping once, twice. A quiet rhythm, a decision forming. Because kindness could be ignored, silence could be overlooked. But what he had just witnessed was something else entirely. It was injustice. Clear, undeniable, and for a man like him, unacceptable. Margaret turned to leave, continuing her shift as if it were just another day. But before she could take a step, William spoke again, his voice low, steady, final. "Margaret." She paused, looked back. Yes, he held her gaze. And this time, there was no softness left, only certainty. "This isn't over." Margaret didn't respond. She simply nodded once, as if part of her already knew something was about to change. The diner had settled back into its usual rhythm. Plates clinked, coffee brewed. The bell. Margaret frowned slightly. "Time." He stood, slowly, deliberately. And as he did, something about him changed. It wasn't dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable. The slight bend in his posture straightened. The quiet stillness sharpened into presence. The man who had seemed invisible in the corner no longer was. Margaret felt it. A subtle shift. "What do you mean?" she asked. William reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat. For a brief second, Margaret thought he might pull out money. Instead, he placed something else on the table. A card. Simple.
Clean.
Elegant. Margaret hesitated, then picked it up. Her eyes moved across the surface.
And stopped.
Her breath caught. William Carter. Carter Holdings Group. Chairman and CEO. Her fingers tightened slightly around the card. That's, she whispered. William watched her quietly. Yes, he said. Margaret looked up at him again.
Really looked this time.
And suddenly, the pieces didn't seem so random anymore. The way he carried himself, the way he observed, the way he listened. You've been, she started, but couldn't finish. Pretending, he offered calmly. Margaret nodded faintly.
Why?
William didn't answer immediately. He glanced around the diner. The worn booths, the chipped cups, the people moving through their ordinary lives. I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who want something from me, he said at last. His voice was steady, controlled. But when you take everything away, status, money, influence. He looked back at her. You find out who sees you and who doesn't. Margaret swallowed. And me? She asked quietly. William's expression softened, just slightly. You saw me, he said. Silence settled between them, but it was different now. No longer uncertain, no longer fragile. Margaret glanced back at the card in her hand. I don't understand, she said. Why are you telling me this? William's gaze hardened, not toward her, but toward something else. Something beyond this moment. Because what happened today, he said slowly, wasn't just cruel. A pause. It was illegal. Margaret's heart skipped. They said everything was legal, she replied. William shook his head slightly. People say many things, he said. That doesn't make them true. He stepped closer to the table, lowered his voice. Margaret, did you ever fully understand what you were signing? She hesitated. Then, quietly,
No.
William nodded once, as if that confirmed everything. I had my legal team review cases like this before, he continued. It's not uncommon. Elder manipulation. Fraud through trust. The words felt heavy, clinical, but real. Margaret's hand trembled slightly. You think they... I don't think, William said. I know where to look. For the first time since she lost everything, a different emotion surfaced. Not grief, not resignation, but something unfamiliar, something fragile. Hope. William straightened. I'm going to make a few calls, he said. Then, after a brief pause, if you're willing, I'd like to help you get your life back. Margaret stared at him, at the man she had shared half a sandwich with, at the man she thought was just another lonely soul. And in that moment, everything changed. Margaret didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her, something long buried under grief and resignation, had begun to stir. Hope. Fragile. Unfamiliar. Dangerous. The next morning, William was already waiting when she arrived at the diner. Not in the corner this time. At a table near the window, where the light reached clearly, where nothing was hidden. You're early, Margaret said, tying her apron. I had work to do, William replied. There was something different about him now. No longer blending in. No longer invisible. He gestured to the seat across from him. Sit, he said gently. Margaret hesitated. Then slowly she did. William placed a thin folder on the table. Neatly organized. Precise. Margaret's heart tightened at the sight of it. What is this? She asked. Your life, he said quietly. Or, at least, what was taken from it. She opened the folder with careful hands. Inside were copies, documents, signatures, dates, legal language she barely understood, but recognized just enough to feel the weight of it. They transferred everything within 6 weeks, William explained. The house, the accounts, even secondary assets. Margaret's breath caught. That fast. Yes, he said. Too fast. He leaned forward slightly. There are inconsistencies, he continued. Timing issues. Witness signatures that don't align. And, more importantly, patterns. Margaret looked up. Patterns? William nodded. I've seen this before, he said. People exploiting trust. Using emotional pressure to secure legal control. Margaret's hands trembled. I trusted them, she whispered again. I know, William said. And this time, there was no judgment in his voice. Only certainty. He slid one document closer to her. This, he said, is a power of attorney form. Margaret frowned. I don't remember signing that. You probably didn't, William replied calmly. The words hit harder than anything before. You mean? I mean, he said carefully, there's a strong possibility these documents were manipulated or obtained under false pretenses. Margaret leaned back slightly. The room felt smaller, tighter. So what does that mean? She asked. William held her gaze. It means, he said, what they did may not hold up in court. Silence. Then,
Court.
Margaret repeated. Yes. She looked down at the papers again. At her name, her signature, or something that looked like it. I don't know if I can do that, she said quietly. William didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, understanding something deeper than the words. This isn't about revenge, he said after a moment. It's about truth. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly. They're my children, she said. William nodded. And they used that against you. The words landed heavily, because they were true, and truth was harder to ignore than pain. William closed the folder gently. I've already contacted my legal team, he said. They're reviewing everything. Margaret blinked. You already started? He gave a small nod. I don't wait when something is wrong. A long silence followed. Then Margaret asked, almost hesitantly, what happens next? William's expression sharpened. Focused. Precise. We file a claim, he said. We challenge the transfers. We investigate the signatures. A pause. And we bring them in. Margaret's heart pounded. Daniel and Sophia? Yes. For the first time, fear returned. Not of losing, but of facing. They won't expect it, William added. And that's exactly why it will work. Margaret looked at him, at the man who had once sat quietly in the corner, counting coins, invisible. And now, he was something else entirely. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. William met her gaze, and this time, his answer came without hesitation. Because someone should have protected you. Margaret felt something break, not painfully, but completely. And for the first time since she lost everything, she wasn't standing alone anymore. The letter arrived 3 days later. Not by email, not by phone, but as a formal envelope, thick, precise, unmistakable. Margaret held it in her hands longer than necessary before opening it, because some part of her already knew this was the moment things became real. Across town, Daniel Hayes stared at the same envelope, his name printed cleanly across the front. His expression shifted the moment he read the first line. What is this? Sophia asked, stepping closer. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He kept reading. Then,
His jaw tightened.
It's a legal notice, he said flatly. Sophia frowned. From who? Daniel looked up, and for the first time, there was something unfamiliar in his eyes. Uncertainty. My mother. Sophia's expression didn't change, but her fingers stilled slightly. That's not possible, she said calmly. Everything was finalized. Daniel handed her the papers. Read it.
She did.
Quickly at first, then slower, more carefully, line by line. Challenge to property transfer. Investigation of coercion and fraudulent documentation. Immediate court review requested. Sophia lowered the papers. Her composure held, but just barely. This doesn't make sense, she said. She wouldn't know how to do this. Daniel exhaled sharply. She doesn't. A pause. Someone's helping her. Silence filled the room. Heavy, unspoken. Who? Sophia asked. Daniel shook his head. I don't know. But something about the way he said it meant he was already worried. Across the city, Margaret sat in a quiet office beside William, a different world from the diner.
Clean. Polished.
Controlled. A lawyer stood across from them, flipping through documents with practiced precision. "We've identified multiple irregularities," he said. "Signatures that don't align with verified samples. Timing discrepancies. Missing witness confirmations." Margaret listened, trying to follow, trying to understand. "In simple terms," William said calmly, glancing at her, "they rushed it." The lawyer nodded. "And in doing so, they made mistakes." Margaret's hands rested in her lap.
Still.
But no longer trembling. "And that's enough?" she asked. The lawyer met her gaze. "It's more than enough to open a case." Margaret took a slow breath. "This means I might get everything back." William didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, measured.
Honest.
"It means," he said, "they will have to answer for what they did." Meanwhile, Daniel paced across his living room, his phone pressed to his ear. "I want our lawyer on this immediately," he snapped.
Now.
Sophia stood near the window, arms crossed, thinking, calculating. "This could be a bluff," she said once he hung up. Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied. "This is structured, detailed." He looked back at the papers. "They're serious." For the first time, the balance had shifted. Margaret Hayes was no longer the woman they had dismissed. No longer the one who signed without question. No longer the one who walked away in silence. She was now a problem. And problems had consequences. Days later, the official summons arrived. Court date set. Attendance required.
No exceptions.
Daniel read it twice. Sophia only once. Neither of them smiled. Back in the diner, Margaret tied her apron slowly. Her movements calm, grounded.
Different.
"Everything all right?" Carla asked from the counter. Margaret nodded. "Yes," she said softly. Then, after a brief pause, "It will be." Because for the first time in a long time, the truth wasn't something she carried alone. It was something that was about to be heard. The courtroom was quieter than Margaret expected. Not empty, but controlled. Every sound softened by polished wood and careful attention. Margaret sat beside William, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had chosen a simple outfit. Nothing new, nothing extravagant, but clean, dignified. Hers. Across the room, Daniel and Sophia sat with their lawyer. Impeccably dressed, composed, but not untouched. Not this time. Daniel's eyes met hers briefly, then looked away. Sophia didn't look at her at all. The judge entered. Everyone stood, then sat. And just like that, it began. The proceedings moved quickly, faster than Margaret could fully process. Legal terms, arguments, documents passed from one hand to another. William's legal team spoke with precision.
Clear. Direct.
Unshaken. "The timeline of asset transfer shows irregular acceleration," one attorney stated. "Signatures presented do not fully match verified samples." Another added, "There is evidence suggesting undue influence during execution of legal documents." Margaret listened, each word landing like a piece of something long missing. Not revenge, not anger, but recognition. Daniel's lawyer responded, confident, controlled. "Mrs. Hayes signed all documents willingly," he argued. "There is no evidence of coercion." Margaret's chest tightened, because that part was true. She had signed. But then, William leaned slightly forward, and everything shifted. "We're not disputing the act of signing," he said calmly.
His voice steady.
Measured. "We're questioning the conditions under which those signatures were obtained." The room stilled. "Trust," he continued, "is not a legal loophole. It's a responsibility. And in this case, it was exploited." Margaret felt her breath catch, because for the first time, someone had said it exactly as it was. More documents were presented. Expert analysis.
Signature comparaison.
Timeline inconsistencies. And slowly, the certainty on Daniel's side began to crack. Sophia leaned toward their lawyer, whispering something urgently, her composure still there, but thinner now. Daniel's jaw tightened. His hands clenched once, then released. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. Silence stretched. Heavy. Unavoidable. Then, the decision. Based on the presented inconsistencies and evidence of potential undue influence, the judge began. This court orders a full investigation into the transfer of assets. A pause. And until such review is completed, all transferred properties and accounts will be temporarily reverted to Mrs. Margaret Hayes. The words echoed. Clear. Final. Margaret didn't react immediately. She couldn't, because for a moment, she didn't fully understand. Then it settled. Her home, her life, her name, was hers again. Across the room, Daniel stared forward, silent. Sophia's expression finally shifted. Not anger, not disbelief, but something closer to realization. This wasn't over, but they were no longer in control. Margaret turned slightly, looked at William. He gave a small nod, not triumphant, not proud, just certain. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, open. Margaret stepped out slowly, as if relearning how to walk in a world that had once pushed her out. You did well, William said beside her. Margaret shook her head softly. No, she replied, her voice steady, clear. We did. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was catching up to her life. She felt like she was stepping back into it. Not as someone broken, not as someone discarded, but as someone who had been seen, heard, and finally, restored. Weeks passed, not in chaos, not in conflict, but in quiet, steady change. The investigation moved forward exactly as William had promised. Carefully, thoroughly, without noise, but with undeniable weight. More documents surfaced. More inconsistencies were revealed. And piece by piece, the truth became impossible to ignore. In the end, the ruling was clear. The transfers had been executed under manipulation. The legal structures invalid. The ownership restored. Fully. Permanently. Margaret Hayes stood once again in front of her house. The same house. The same walls. The same door her husband had built with his own hands. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply stood there, looking, remembering, and still chose to be good.